In 1989, if you looked at the spec sheet alone, the Game Boy looked like a mistake. A blurry green screen, no color, no backlight. Nintendo's two biggest rivals in the handheld market had all of that, and more. And yet the Game Boy outsold every rival handheld combined by a margin of nearly 6-1, and stayed in production for over a decade. This is the story of how a company that could afford the best technology on the market deliberately chose not to use it, and how a separate, almost accidental decision made in a hotel room in Moscow turned out to matter more than any spec sheet ever could. Every week we tell the stories of the consoles, studios, and engineering decisions that shaped the video game industry, and what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story of the Game Boy begins not with a screen or a processor, but with a philosophy. Gunpei Yokoi was already a legend inside Nintendo by the late 1980s. He had invented the Game & Watch handheld series, designed the control pad that every console controller in the world still uses in some form today, and built the ROB accessory for the NES. Yokoi worked according to a principle he called lateral thinking with withered technology. Rather than chase the newest, most expensive components available, Yokoi looked for mature, well-understood, inexpensive technology and found creative, unconventional uses for it. Cheaper components meant a cheaper final product, longer battery life, and fewer things that could break. When Yokoi's team designed the Game Boy, that philosophy shaped every decision. The screen was a simple monochrome LCD, 4 shades of green, no backlight. There was no color. There was no advanced graphics processor. On paper, it looked like Nintendo had built a portable console for 1985, not 1989. The Game Boy launched in Japan on April 21, 1989. Nintendo shipped 300,000 units. It sold out instantly, with demand far outpacing what the company could supply. The North American launch followed on July 31, 1989, priced at $89.95. But Nintendo wasn't alone in the handheld market for long, and the competition that followed made the Game Boy's limitations look, on paper, like a serious liability. Atari released the Lynx on September 1, 1989, just weeks after the Game Boy's American debut. The Lynx was, by any technical measure, a dramatically more capable machine. It featured a full-color backlit screen, a custom 16-bit graphics chip, and hardware sprite scaling that let it rotate and resize graphics in ways the Game Boy simply could not do. Sega followed in 1990 with the Game Gear, built around hardware shared with the Sega Master System, offering its own full-color backlit display with a sharper resolution and more colors on screen than the Lynx. Journalists and industry commentators at the time were blunt about the comparison. The Lynx and Game Gear were, in raw specifications, simply better hardware. The Game Boy's blurry green screen was seen as a genuine embarrassment next to what Atari and Sega were showing off. None of that mattered, because Yokoi's team had made one decision that neither Atari nor Sega had prioritized: battery life. The Game Boy ran on 4 AA batteries for approximately 30 hours of continuous play. The Atari Lynx, with its power-hungry color backlit screen, managed roughly 4 to 5 hours on 6 AA batteries. The Sega Game Gear was worse still, draining 6 AA batteries in 3 to 5 hours, for a device built to survive car trips, waiting rooms, and long school days. That gap wasn't a minor inconvenience. It was the difference between a handheld you could actually use away from a wall outlet and one that needed a fresh set of batteries every single afternoon. Price told the same story. The Game Boy launched at $89.95. The Lynx launched at $179.95, nearly double. The Game Gear came in at $149.99. Nintendo's withered technology wasn't just about batteries. It made the entire machine dramatically cheaper to manufacture and to buy, but hardware specifications and pricing only explained part of the Game Boy's dominance. The other half of the story happened almost by accident in a hotel room in Moscow. In 1988, at the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas, a Japanese software publisher named Henk Rogers stood in front of a small computer screen and could not stop playing the same game. He got back in line to play it 4 more times. The game was Tetris. Rogers ran bulletproof software, and he already held the rights to release Tetris on Nintendo's family computer in Japan, where it became his company's biggest hit. But when Nintendo of America president Minoru Arakawa asked Rogers what game should be bundled with the upcoming Game Boy, Rogers didn't suggest Nintendo's own mascot. He suggested Tetris. His pitch, according to Rogers' own later retelling, was direct: bundle the Game Boy with Mario, and the console becomes a toy for young boys. Bundle it with Tetris, and the Game Boy becomes a game system for everyone. There was just one problem. The rights to Tetris were a tangled mess. Rogers had secured the rights to release Tetris on Japanese home computers and the Famicom, but the rights to console and handheld versions worldwide were caught in a chain of licensing agreements running through a British company, an American company, and the Soviet government agency that controlled Tetris's creator. Multiple parties, including a subsidiary of Atari, believed they held the rights to put Tetris on gaming hardware. In February of 1989, with Nintendo's Game Boy launch just months away and no confirmed rights to the game, Rogers had promised them he flew to Moscow, and eventually convinced its director that Nintendo was a far more serious partner than the smaller companies competing for the same rights. Rogers walked out of Moscow with the console and handheld rights to Tetris. Atari's gaming subsidiary, which had already begun selling an unlicensed console version, was hit with a court injunction in June of 1989 and forced to destroy its remaining unsold cartridges. On July 31, 1989, the Game Boy launched across North America bundled with Tetris instead of a Mario title. The pairing turned out to be exactly what Rogers had promised Arakawa it would be: a simple, endlessly replayable game that appealed to children and adults, to gamers and people who had never owned a game console in their life. The Atari Lynx and Sega Game Gear kept fighting for the technically superior side of the handheld market for years afterward. Neither ever seriously threatened Nintendo's lead. The Lynx sold roughly 2 million units over its lifetime before Atari discontinued it in 1995. The Game Gear performed better, reaching around 14 million units, but Sega itself would later describe the Game Boy's dominance as effectively uncontested. The original Game Boy and its later Game Boy Color successor combined sold over 118 million units worldwide, spawning a software library of more than 1,000 games and cementing a design philosophy Nintendo would return to again and again in the decades that followed. The industry press in 1989 was right about one thing. The Game Boy's screen really was worse than its rivals. What the specification sheets couldn't capture was that a gray-green screen with 30 hours of battery life, bundled with a game engineered to be impossible to put down, would outlast and outsell every technically superior alternative the market could offer. Gunpei Yokoi built a console around withered technology because he believed the specs on a page were never the point. Henk Rogers flew to Moscow because he believed the same thing about the 60 games. Neither man was betting on the most powerful handheld ever built. They were both betting on the one people would actually still be carrying in their pocket 10 years later. They were right.